I'm Barry Boyce. Hello, everyone. I'm founding editor of Mindful Magazine and mindful.org. Welcome back. For our last session of the day, I'd like to introduce David Treleaven, who will be speaking to us about trauma-sensitive mindfulness. And a little bit about David. David's a writer, educator, and trauma professional, and he's author of the acclaimed book, Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, and also the founder of the Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness community. That's a group of practitioners committed to setting a standard of care through mindfulness-based practices, interventions, and programs. Now, before I turn things over to David, a couple of minor housekeeping notes. If you have any technical or logistical questions, please put them in the chat tab to the right of your video. If you have a question for David, please put it in the Q&A tab on the right of your screen, and I'll look for them and we'll take care of them when it gets to the Q&A part of things. So, welcome, David.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks. It's really fun to get to tag team this with you. And I think we met a couple of years ago. So anyway, it's just a real honor to get to share this with you. So Barry and I have talked. We're going to try our best to, work in collaboration with you all. So I'll come back to Barry at some point for questions. But hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Total honor to be here. I want to thank the team at Mindful that put this together. And I know that you've had probably a couple of sessions if you've been able to be live. So it's a real honor to get to be this third session of the day. And as you would have seen from the title, I'm going to be speaking here and in some practice with you all about the relationship between mindfulness, meditation, and trauma. And the main goal that I have with this session is to really support you all in the different roles that you're in, the different contexts that you're both practicing and teaching in. I want this to be a really useful session for you all. Now, one thing we did this on the fly, so we'll see how it goes, but we created a poll. And so, Barry, I might invite you back in if you see the stats, but we had a couple questions for you here, and we wanted to get a sense for me especially, of how many people in this group right now are actually teaching mindfulness, and how many of you are more practicing, more practitioners that are in, and then also around healthcare. We wanted to just get a sense of the group that's here. So Barry, I'll just leave an open mic here if you want to jump in any time with the poll stats. I think we figured it out. So let me know. You can just jump in at any time.
Yeah, I'm working on finding the results. There's still people who are answering the poll.
Okay, great. So I'll try to pause at some point. I just want to get a sense. So as a way, partly as an introduction, often where my work has been around trauma-sensitive mindfulness is working with those who are teaching mindfulness and meditation, but this session is going to be more general, but we just got curious about who's here. So I'm coming to you from the Bay Area in California, and I came down here about 13 years ago, originally from Canada. And I just want to start, really take a moment to acknowledge the global pandemic and just the various communities that you'll be coming here from. I imagine it's a very international audience. And so while things are changing, in this particular community here in the US, I have family back in Canada where things are the worst they've been. I know in India right now, in Southeast Asia, it's very intense with COVID. So wherever you are, just sending care and appreciation that you're here. And I said this to the organizing team, I'm really grateful for this summit. I'm so grateful for the topic. The moment that I heard this, I thought, yes, absolutely. I want to be a part of this. I'm really on. I have two family members who are frontline healthcare workers, and a lot of people in the community that Barry just mentioned that I'm within, they're doing mindfulness-based work with healthcare providers. And so there's been a lot of questions this whole last 15 months and going forward of how to most effectively serve people who have been doing healthcare work and on frontline work. So it's just a topic that I care a lot about. Every time I'm in a situation like this, I learn a lot. So just looking forward to this session together. And basically, I'm going to be proposing two things. So some of you will know my work, but I imagine a lot of you won't. And the two things I'll be proposing is one, that mindfulness and meditation, it can either help or hinder people and communities who are struggling with trauma. It's something of a double-edged sword, which can be a little counterintuitive, where often there's an assumption that mindfulness helps with stress, therefore it would help with traumatic stress, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And then the second part here is that the more that we can understand the very particular relationship and nuanced relationship between mindfulness and trauma, the more effective that we can be in our practice, or if we're teaching mindfulness to others, the more safe and effective that we can be. And that it's especially important right now that in any room where we're practicing mindfulness, trauma will be present and on some level.
David, I
Yeah,
just
jump
wanted
in.
to note the responses seem to all be in now.
Okay,
So 59% of the folks out there teach meditation,
great.
and half of them work in a medical facility.
Fantastic. Okay, so we're a little bit closely split down the middle. Perfect. Okay, good. So the first thing I'll say here is that it's very humbling to be in the role that I've been in, especially the last year. I've been really researching this for the last 15 years, and it's humbling to have the work around trauma and meditation be so relevant right now with COVID. So last week I was at I got to present to a nursing conference. It was called Ethics in Action. It was a group of about 150 nurses through Stanford University. And for the first hour before I presented, a group of nurses actually took an hour of story sharing to detail some of the experiences that they had had over this past year. And it was painful, it was poignant, it was so powerful to actually get to hear and witness some of the adversity and the trauma that so many people had both witnessed and been exposed to as part of their work. And so I left that conference just feeling like I felt humbled. I also felt like there's so much power inside of mindfulness and meditation community. When I look through the different speakers here at the summit, there's so much utility and strength, and it's a real practical series of practices to help people work with suffering. And that this is a moment that's asking, I think, so many of us, both in our lives, our practices, and especially those of us teaching, to show up really well, to really bring the best of practice forward. And in my opinion, to do so in a way that's very sensitive to the needs of people who are struggling with trauma. So that's what we're going to be focused on here is, and it's part of the subtitle of this session, how do we show up well in this moment? What's trauma sensitive mindfulness? And my goal here is to really mix it up. So I'm not going to talk the whole time. I have a couple of things I want to share, kind of frame and give us some scaffolding, but I really want this to be also practice based, so that you'll come out of the session with also some of your own resilience and also to be in practice together. So a couple, just how I'm going to talk about this, or what we're going to cover in the session. One, I'll talk about briefly about trauma, its relevance right now, especially within mindfulness community. Second, why meditation is something of a double-edged sword when it comes to trauma. And then third is really offering you tools and practices in trauma-sensitive mindfulness. I do a training around this, and it's really like a semester-long kind of course. So, I'll try to get the best of trauma-sensitive mindfulness work here. And so Barry and I, I've known Barry for a little bit, and I've asked him to just please, he's going to be in this unique role of really trying to, I think it's Wuva. He's going to be monitoring the chat. So if and as you have questions and comments, please chat them. Please engage. This is a lot about sharing resources. And Barry's going to do his best to really bring forward some of the questions. I think you can upvote them as well. And I also told Barry that if he wants to jump in, given his many years and decades into practice, I just invite that. So Barry, please jump in if you want to add something or you have a question.
Oh, that's very kind, David.
Yeah,
Lovely.
please. We'll tag team it together. And finally, just a disclaimer here is that, speaking about trauma is evocative. And even if it's a somewhat, you know, intellectual conversation, it just brings it all forward. So just the request here is for you to be self-responsive inside this session. Maybe you've been on a number of sessions today, but if you need a break, grab some water, stretch, whatever you need, please be self-responsive. Let's just begin with a very brief meditation. Help you arrive, help us all have a little bit of presence and ground as we lean into this topic. So I just invite you to take a couple of moments here to settle and find a posture that you'd like to be in for the next few minutes. You're welcome to have your eyes open or closed. And to begin, I invite you to take a couple of deeper breaths. If the breath feels too activating and overwhelming, you can always shift your focus elsewhere. Otherwise, just a couple of deeper inhales and exhales. Drawing air into the lungs, perhaps a pause at the top, and then a slow exhale as well, in your own time, at your own rhythm. Perhaps feeling your buttocks in a chair, the feet on the floor. Just taking a moment here to ground in the body. And just noticing the quality of presence that's here right now. Ideally without judgment, but simply noticing what's here, wherever you are in your day. You might notice your mood right now. What's your mood? How are you coming into this session? You might work with labeling the mood. That's useful. You could also notice what told you that that was your emotional state. Maybe it was some sensations that are predominant or less predominant right now. Or maybe there's some narratives present. And as best as you can, simply allowing all of that to be here. That there's just some basic agreement with your experience in the here and now. And then finally, the invitation is to extend some care towards yourself in this moment, for being here, for turning in to this topic, maybe for the work and the practice that you've been in for these months, this past year. Just taking a moment to turn some appreciation internal. You could do this through a gesture. Could be a hand on the heart or the belly. Could also be through a word or a simple phrase, like what you need to hear right now. But just taking a moment to bring some presence and care to yourself. And then if there's anyone in particular that you'd like to extend this to, people that you're close with, those who you serve in your work, or communities in particular who might be suffering right now, you're also welcome to extend this care and kindness to them as well. Letting these people be in mind and heart as we enter into this topic. In the next few breaths, we'll be shifting here. So whatever would support a transition for you, whether a little bit of movement, or maybe a couple of deeper breaths, you're welcome to do that as we prepare to shift. Okay. So as a way to begin, and just give a little foundation here. I want to talk briefly about trauma, just to give us a little scaffolding, and then we'll be moving towards a practice around trauma-sensitive mindfulness. So the definition of trauma that I use, it's quite connected to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, recent edition that many of you will know. And that trauma is the response to shocking and emotionally overwhelming situations that may involve actual or threatened death, serious injury, or threat to physical integrity. So the response to emotionally overwhelming situations that may involve actual or threatened death, serious injury, or threat to physical integrity. We're really talking about situations that involve life and limb when we're in the domain of trauma. And something that most of you will know is that we can experience trauma in different ways. I often think of it like a kind of something that ripples out from a point in the water, where with a traumatic event, we can directly experience an overwhelming and traumatic event. We can also experience trauma by witnessing the event, witnessing a car crash, something traumatic, intense. We can also experience trauma by learning that a trauma occurred to a family member or a close friend, someone in kind of our inner circle. And we can also experience trauma through repeated exposure, sometimes known as secondary or tertiary trauma. And this, from my work in healthcare this last year, often holds a lot of relevance for those of us that are working with others closely and that are exposed to trauma over and over. It's through this repeated exposure we might develop our own trauma symptoms. Now, not everyone, of course, who lives through a trauma will necessarily develop any kind of ongoing symptoms. They won't be worse for wear. My cousin, I mentioned a couple family members, my one cousin back in Ontario, he's a paramedic. And he reminds me that he's exposed to trauma and has been exposed to trauma a lot for a number of years, has not necessarily experienced any adverse symptoms. But as can happen for some people, we can experience ongoing symptoms after a traumatic event. And this is sometimes known as post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are symptoms that we can experience that they really range. One could be intrusive thoughts or intrusive memories like flashbacks, where we suddenly have images that relate back to the traumatic experience, or sensations that really overtake our body that are very painful. We might also begin to practice avoidance, like we're habitually avoiding certain street corners or geographical locations. We might also avoid certain sensations or reminders of the trauma that live inside of us. So there's a lot of different things that can happen with post-traumatic stress. And for those of you that work with trauma, you know that post-traumatic stress, it is intense, it's painful, and it creates a lot of problems and issues in terms of relating to ourselves, relating to others, and just being able to live often a happy, healthy, stable life. It's very difficult and painful. So I said that I've been working with people in healthcare. And of the number of people I've talked to this last 6 months, a lot of people have said, my staff is highly traumatized, or at the very least, we are very burnt out. We have been in the throes of this pandemic, so much unknown, so much anticipatory grief in many ways. And so there's a lot of trauma inside the healthcare system right now. And this has happened through both repeated exposure, I'd say, which is, kind of classic element of trauma, but it's also happening through what's sometimes referred to as moral injury. And this is when people are being placed in basically impossibly difficult situations where they're forced to go against what feels right or feels just and moral to them by virtue of the structures that are in place. So a classic example that I'm sure many of you have either experienced or have heard of are healthcare workers who have been placed in the position of needing to be kind of a boundary between someone in a hospital and a family member who's outside the hospital. And with CDC guidelines, not allowing that person to actually come and visit the family. So I just talked to a number of nurses who were saying, this put me in a really impossible situation where I was left feeling very dysregulated and a lot of pain, and I'm still carrying it with me. So that seems to be the current state of affairs, is that there is a high level of trauma and adversity in both individual nervous systems of people working in healthcare and also the larger healthcare systems more generally. There's just a tremendous amount of pressure on the system. So for the rest of this session, what we're going to talk about is, well, what does that mean? And that what can we actually do about it? What's the move here? And I imagine that's why many of you are here with the summit, and I'm hoping there will be many people who will be offering many different powerful answers to this question about basically how can we practice. And my work, as Barry said earlier, and then Barry, in a moment, I'll come to you in about 5 minutes to see if there's any kind of burning questions, is around what's called trauma-sensitive mindfulness. And what that means in a very simple way is that if you're practicing or teaching trauma-sensitive mindfulness, you are sensitive to the needs of people and communities who are struggling with trauma. And inside of meditation, because I mentioned it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I'll talk to you more about that. It's very important to be able to recognize trauma and respond skillfully. That's really what we're up to. It's sometimes called trauma-informed practice. And really at the base of it is doing our best to ensure that people aren't harming themselves or becoming re-traumatized inside of practice. I mean, as you all know, meditation, asking anyone to pay close and sustained attention to their inner world, their experience in the here and now, that's a really, really powerful thing to do. It's especially powerful if someone is experiencing traumatic stress. So that's where we're starting here. It's the starting point. Like, what do we need to know? What can we be practicing together? Before I talk to you about the nuts and bolts of this, and talk to you through some real practices, I want to offer you a practice here to help you experience what I mean by trauma sensitive. Because in many ways, there's a long list of things we can learn over years around protocols, intake forms, all these things. But then there's also how we're being, how we're showing up, what we embody in our own practice and as teachers. So that's kind of the dual piece of this work. And I want to just begin here with you all with a practice to help convey, here's what I mean by trauma sensitive, at a really base level. So Barry, I'm gonna guide this practice, and then I'll pause, I'll open it up and see if there's any burning questions.
Great. Thanks, David.
Cool. So this is going to be an optional practice, and it's going to involve working with your hands. If you don't have access to your hands, you might have arthritis or don't have your hands, you can work with your feet, or you can also just visualize this practice. It's a two-part practice. Again, this is meant to convey what trauma-sensitive mindfulness or really trauma-sensitive practice feels like, kind of at a visceral level. So I'm going to have my hands up here in the screen, but you don't have to have them up here. You can have them in your lap, but I just want to have them here so you can see. So here's the invitation. First part of the practice is to close your fist, and I'd like you to imagine that the job of this fist is to stay closed. And in staying closed, the fist is taking care of your safety. Yeah, closed fist, taking care of your safety. It's its job. Then with your other hand, as an experiment, I'd like you to try to go ahead and pry open the fist. And literally give yourself that experience for a moment. Just see what happens. Notice what happens to your breath, your mood, or what happens to the fist. Cool. Okay, then you can let that go. You can shake it out if you want. You can take a breath, and then we'll do part 2 of the practice. Same beginning, closed fist, taking care of your safety. And then with the other hand, the invitation is to bring a quality of care and really like respect. Care, respect, and curiosity. And then with that hand, I invite you to place the hand underneath the fist for a moment. And as you make contact with the fist, it's like you're saying and communicating, good job. And of course you're closed. Of course you're closed. Like you're taking care of safety. That's really an intelligent thing to do. and I'm here with no agenda. I'm here to listen. And then just notice, same thing, how that impacts the fist, your breath, your mood. And for this last part, you could even experiment with supporting the fist to close. Like, I'm going to help you to do that. I got you. I'm right here. Okay, and then you can let that go. And just invite you to take a few breaths here, kind of a pause. And just noticing, like, similar, different, where are you right now? Whatever emotion is here, whether neutral, more flat, or more emotion, just see if you can make room for that. And also invite you, if you're inspired, please, you're welcome to share in the WUVA, it's still a new name for me, into the chat. You're welcome to let others know here how you're doing, how it impacted you, a chance to connect with each other. So I'll just say one thing, and then Barry, I'll come to you. The way that connects to trauma sensitive mindfulness, just to be explicit, is that trauma often involves deep survival based strategies. And it was sometimes talked about as fight, flight, or freeze. That's fundamentally taking care of our safety, of our survival. So in some ways, it's a fist that's doing this job. And trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive practice fundamentally is about having deep, deep respect for the survival strategies that we have or that others have. So that's the contact here, is to say, I'm going to respect this survival strategy. And be an invitation here in many ways. So we could do this for ourselves, and we can also do this for others. So for this next half hour, as we're talking about trauma-sensitive mindfulness, it really will come back to this core principle, you could say in some ways, of nonviolence, but coming back to this feeling. And of course, we'll get into the technicalities as well. So Barry, in a moment, I'm going to get right into why would meditation get people into trouble? But I just want to see, maybe you could give us a little temperature check. Any burning questions? We can also wait to the end, or anything you want to share that you're seeing in the chat.
Yeah, David, there's just a lot of comments in the chat about it. It's a deeply impactful practice. The one you just did with the fist and the hand, and one of the folks said, K Rash, the second part led me to hold the fist less tightly. I didn't have to clench so much. I could feel safe without threat. It was beautiful and informative. Love this example. Really brings home how to connect with trauma-sensitive mindfulness. Supportive hand fist allowed my breath, body, and fist to soften. Felt allowing and supportive. Respect, relief for what is within. Feels different, and I can even feel warm at the second part, especially holding the fist.
That's
now great. I really get it. Thank you. Anyway, it keeps coming. There's lots of that kind of stuff. I found it quite powerful too, David, because so often in mindfulness teaching, we encourage vulnerability, but for someone, or when we have trauma, that can be quite a challenging notion.
Yeah, absolutely. Where we kind of invite people to open up, and then it might flood might crack the container and be too much. So absolutely. Thanks, Barry. That's really helpful to hear.
There's been, well, I think maybe we'll just do one question before
Sure.
you move on, because it got quite a lot of votes.
Great.
And you can decide to leave it to the end if you like.
Okay.
There's a question about writing a mindfulness meditation script in a trauma-informed way, trauma-informed practice.
Yes. That's kind of the question, is like, how do we make this trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive? Well, in some ways, any modifications or interventions inside of a practice will come back to this principle. And then I probably need a little bit more time to fill it out a little bit. Can I come back to that one? It's a great question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but let's come back to that one, because that's really, when I'm doing trainings, that's what it's all about. It's all about how would we offer meditations or write one that's trauma informed. So I'll come back to that by the end, but let's hold that for a second. Okay, well, let me move on here. I'll fill it out a little bit here, and then we'll get into more practice too. And just when you were sharing, it reminded me of one thing as we dive in. Sometimes people can mishear teachings on trauma sensitive mindfulness, at least in my experience, as coddling or walking on eggshells. Like, oh, we need to be almost pitying, to the degree, oh, it's too bad. And I want to be clear that trauma sensitive mindfulness to me is actually saying it's very important that people actually learn to be able to tolerate and be present with greater and greater sensations, emotions, traumas. And it isn't about coddling or being soft, but it's actually saying people might need additional tools in order to get the most out of their meditation. So it's not trying to reinvent the wheel, getting away from meditation. Meditation's still at the center here. But sometimes people think, oh, we're just going to be doing trauma therapy, and that's not what we're doing. So spend a few minutes with you here, just a couple minutes on, well, why would it be a double-edged sword? Why would meditation and mindfulness not just be kind of a general solution or something that we can consistently recommend to people? And the fact that you're here watching this, to me, half of the battle is learning, or half of the fill in different metaphor is actually having awareness about why people can run into difficulty around trauma and meditation. So the fact that you're here, that's great. Here's the basic headline. If you ask someone to meditate and pay attention to their experience in the here and now, there's a possibility that they will end up hyper focusing or over focusing on what's called traumatic stimuli. And in doing so, they can end up overwhelming their nervous system. That's the main headline, is that meditation can be something of a setup for people to overwhelm themselves in the process. The way this, I found this easy to talk about, is actually the myth of Medusa. Some of you might know Peter Levine. He's the creator of somatic experiencing, which is a psychotherapeutic approach to trauma. And Levine used the myth of Medusa to say, if you can understand Medusa, you can understand how to work with trauma. And it actually applies very concretely over to meditation. So most of you will know the myth. We have Medusa, this very powerful Gorgon, who has the superpower that if you look directly into Medusa's eyes, you freeze, you turn to stone. And so Perseus, who has this task of trying to defeat Medusa, goes to Athena, goddess of knowledge, and says, basically, what do I do? And Athena says, you need a shield. You cannot look directly at Medusa. Peter Levine said, this is one of the core principles of good trauma therapy. Now, there are disagreements in the field, but it's pretty popular that you don't ask someone to go right at trauma. You don't start a session by saying, tell me all about your trauma. If someone was experiencing traumatic sensations, you don't necessarily ask them to focus in on those sensations right away. If they do, it's like you're asking people to focus on Medusa. With post-traumatic stress, in many ways, it's like Medusa lives on inside of someone. It's like the monster kind of gets trapped in the psychobiology. So at any point, it feels like I might become dysregulated or have flashbacks. Levine was saying, if you just ask someone to pay hyper-focus on these traumatic stimuli, thoughts, flashbacks, memories, it can be too much too soon. And what people need is they actually need tools. They need a shield, like Perseus did, to not go directly at trauma, because it will pull you in like a vortex and it can overwhelm the nervous system. So why is this important? So just imagine then the setup inside of a meditation hall, where if someone comes to meditation, say they're experiencing trauma, they've heard the benefits of meditation, they come to a practice, they follow basic instructions, and in doing so, they encounter traumatic stimuli. let's say it's a sensations of immobility in the chest, like a freeze that really got locked in the body. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing if someone is contacting traumatic stimuli. But if they don't have tools to work with, in all likelihood, they'll just keep coming back to that predominant stimuli. In some ways, if you think about it, it only makes sense. It's like if we can't breathe or we're feeling these sensations, we're going to pay attention there because it's taking care of our survival. So, because of this, what will often happen in meditation, and this has been 15 years of research for me now, I keep hearing of people who were in their practice. And if the teacher was not trauma informed, they would basically say, just take it back to the cushion, just take it back to practice. And a lot of the trauma sensitive work here in meditation is to say, meditation is awesome. It's very powerful. Trauma survivors need it. And they will also need additional tools and modifications in order to actually work skillfully with their trauma. Otherwise, you run the risk of re-traumatization. So that's the main headline, all summed up in hopefully like 4 minutes there. Happy to talk more about it. But again, meditation will tend to have us hyper focus on trauma. We often need something different. I'll just tell a quick story. When I started to do my own trauma work, the first session I went in, the trauma therapist said, I want you to tell me about what's working. I was like, I don't want to talk about what's working. I'm here to like work with what's not working, what's traumatic. And the person said, I get that, but your capacity to be with what's difficult is going to be tied to your capacity to be with what's good or what's resourcing for you. And that opened up a whole terrain for me inside of trauma work that really actually maps quite well over to meditation. So let's get into the tools here for the rest, and then we'll save a little bit of time for questions. But let's move to practice and tools. So, given that, if that holds water for you, what do we do? What are the modifications we can make while keeping meditation at the center, the power of contemplative practice? Well, really, it's about those shields, it's about those tools. Some of you might have seen Sharon Salzberg earlier today. I had the chance to interview her on a podcast, and Sharon was doing work with survivors of gun violence, doing a lot of work around trauma. And she said what was most key is tools, that we're giving people who are experiencing trauma tools, not just meditation. Meditation is one very powerful tool, and then we have a whole bunch of tools inside of that. So let me offer you some tools that we can work with. Let's see, where are we going to start? So the first is working with. Well, let me offer a regulating practice first, and then we'll get to working with anchors of attention. So actually, no, I'm going to start with the anchors. So one of the things in meditation that, depending on your tradition, is that we end up focusing on the breath as an anchor. This is a place to kind of focus the attention, especially in the early parts of practice, this focused attention as opposed to open monitoring, where we're cultivating some mental stability, which is a component of mindfulness. So often the breath, I don't know about many of you, but the breath was a very common anchor as a place to focus attention. With trauma, the breath will not always be neutral. It will be a place that might actually connect people back into their trauma. Our respiratory system is intimately connected to our sympathetic nervous system, which is connected to fight, flight, and trauma. That's all to say that the breath just won't always be an easy place for people to cultivate mindfulness. So, one very simple and standard trauma sensitive mindfulness practice is offering people multiple anchors of attention. So we're going to do a brief practice here working with 3 different anchors of attention. The breath will be one, but we're also going to work with hearing or sound and different sensations in the body. Again, an anchor is just a way to actually cultivate some mental stability and mindfulness. So it doesn't have to be the breath. And we want to leave people in choice in their practice. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and once again find a posture that invites a sense of practice here. And if you'd like, you could start with a couple of deeper and fuller breaths. Again, if the breath is more overwhelming, you can back off of that. Otherwise, just taking a moment here to check in. Notice what's been activated in this session so far. It could be your mood or just simply noticing what's present right now. And then when you're ready, the invitation is to focus on sensations or constellations of sensation in the body that is not necessarily connected to the breath. So that might be the feeling of the feet touching the floor or the buttocks, chair, maybe the hands in the lap, or other sensations. But see if you can find some sensations that feel somewhat neutral to positive for you to focus on. If that's not available to you, you can also focus your attention external to you. You could find something in your surrounding environment to work with. Otherwise, seeing if you can find some sensations and then letting this be your momentary anchor of attention. Bringing your attention to these sensations. Letting your attention rest here. And if you find yourself distracted or drifting into thought, the instruction is just to gently bring your attention back to this anchor. Letting yourself be in the experiment here with this anchor. Maybe it's a newer anchor or a familiar one. But just noticing the quality of connection you have with this anchor in this moment. And then we'll move to sound or hearing as an anchor. So bringing your attention, if hearing is available, to the soundscape around you. If hearing is not an option, you might be hearing impaired, you can also work with sight or another sense here. Otherwise, letting yourself be present with the experience of hearing. Receiving the sounds that are in your environment right now. And then letting this be an anchor. Also noticing, how does this anchor compare to the first? Is it easier? Maybe it's more difficult to rest your attention here. And then finally, we'll move to a third anchor, and that's working with the breath. So that might be sensations coming in and out of the nostrils, or the rising and falling of the abdomen or the chest. And just letting this be the anchor of attention for this moment. Coming back here is a place to cultivate and build mindfulness, sustained attention. And then to end the practice, I invite you to choose an anchor you'd like to complete with so that you get to feel in choice here about where you're focusing your attention. Maybe it was the breath, sensations, or sound, hearing. And just finishing and completing here as a reminder of your own autonomy, and then preparing to shift out of this practice. So that's an example of a foundational trauma sensitive practice around anchors. And the main principle here is choice. So getting back to this question, Barry, that you mentioned about how would you write a trauma sensitive meditation? Really, we're working with principles here. I mean, we can talk more about techniques, but one of the primary principles is choice. People who are struggling with trauma often have had choice taken away. That might have been like in the actual moment of a traumatic event, or it could have been over a series of events in childhood where choice was not available, or it could be with post-traumatic stress where someone just feels like, God, at any moment I'm just being taken over by these flashbacks or these, really painful sensations. So whenever we can offer choice back to people that we're working with, or giving ourselves that autonomy and permission, the more trauma sensitive a practice can be. Now, we can go so far that we are offering too much choice. So, a subtle caution there. I'd say 2 or 3 choices in a practice maximum. I know when I started, I would say, you can have your eyes open or closed, or you can do whatever you want. It was really too diffuse. So we need to provide that container, but again, leaving people in choice as we're offering practice. So that was one. And let me work 12, 15. Let me work with, let's do one more, and then we'll open it up for questions. Actually, 2 more. These will be related. So a big part of the work, I won't have the chance to go too deep into it, but a core aspect of trauma sensitive mindfulness work, at least as I've been practicing it, is around helping people to regulate. By that, I mean that there's a sense of stability, of self-connection, that there's a sense of being able to tolerate one's experience. When we experience trauma, we're often experiencing what's known as dysregulated physiological arousal. So it's like the accelerator and the brake of our nervous system is kind of on the fritz. So at any moment, we might be hypervigilant, or we might be dissociated and numb. A big part of trauma sensitive practice is empowering people with tools to help them regulate and come back into what's known as a window of tolerance, which is, again, a place in between, you could say, hyper and hypoarousal, or too much or too little physiological arousal, where we feel some sense of calm, a sense of connection, a sense of agency. Now, I don't want to go so far to say that the object or the goal of mindfulness practice is to simply be calm, or we can be in our window of tolerance and actually still have a lot of emotion. But there are times where meditation can actually exacerbate, because of the Medusa issue I talked about, exacerbate these dysregulated states. So it's very useful that people have what you could call kind of off ramps on the highway. So they're on the highway in meditation practice. They find themselves overwhelmed. They say, I need to actually shift things up and take a break, because more will not be better in terms of meditation. And they may engage with a purposeful self-regulation practice to help them come back in their window and get the most out of meditation practice. So I want to offer you just a couple of basic self-regulation practices, and then we'll open it up for some dialogue here with all of you. So the first one is working with the breath and working with our hands again. And you can visualize this. It's an optional practice, or you can work with your hands. And this is about continuing to offer control and agency back to people struggling with trauma. It could be ourselves struggling with trauma, or people we're teaching and working with. What you're going to do is you're going to have your hands about just a little less than shoulder width apart. I'm going to have them here so you can see them, but you can have them lower. You could also have them turned this way. And the invitation is to open and close your hands with the inhalation and the exhalation of the breath. So for me, it would be inhale, exhale. Inhaling, exhaling. Could be also inhaling, exhaling. And as you're doing this, see if you can find the depth and the pace that feels most regulating and supportive for you. So maybe for you right now, it's about taking some deeper, longer breaths, and you can control that with your hands. Or maybe it's a different pace of breath. You can control that as well. The feeling here is that you have some semblance of agency and control with the breath. And you can also choose where to focus your attention. Maybe it's the hands, maybe it's the breath, maybe it's both. Just a couple more here. This was created by a Qigong and trauma professional who had also done work around Hakomi therapy and found this was a very regulating practice. It's kind of their go-to practice for the last 15 years. Okay, one more here. And you can let that go. So that is a practice where if you are meditating and you find yourself at a point where more focus is actually creating increased dysregulation and it's creating a sense of overwhelm, more might not always be better when it comes to attention. Sometimes just being mindful and sticking with it, that will work. Other times we might actually need to work with our experience in a different way. That's a regulating practice, invites a sense of agency and control with the breath, which can often feel out of control when it comes to trauma. The last one I'll show you is practices around self-contact. So in mindful self-compassion, this is very common. It's often called soothing self-touch. I'll stand up so you can see. So I'm going to offer a couple of different physical contact practices, physical contact you can make. And you can just try them out as a kind of experiment for you here. But touch and contact can often be quite regulating for us. So first position, we'll do 3, is to have a hand on the heart and any variation you want here. So it could be 2 hands on the heart, hand on the heart and belly, 2 hands in the belly. But just taking a moment here to offer a sense of presence through contact to the nervous system, really to the psychobiology. And you can be with both the experience of receiving the contact and care and presence, and also offering it. And then just noticing what happens with that contact. Bringing mindfulness to the touch. And a second posture you can try involves actually working with the back of the neck. There's some research that suggests that making physical contact with the bottom of the brainstem can actually be very regulating and supportive for us. So I'll show you what it looks like. It's right there. So you can have a hand at the base of the skull. Some people like to have one hand on the forehead to provide a little bit of containment, or up top. You have both hands. Just taking a moment, feeling that contact. Again, bringing some presence, some care. Experimenting with that. And then finally is a practice of containment. So one of the ways I've learned this is a hand under the armpit, or it could be on the shoulder. And then with the other hand, you're providing some containment. Again, it could be under the armpit, it could be on the shoulder, whatever feels right. And then just experiment with the quality of pressure and the placement as well. If we're experiencing traumatic stress, it sometimes feels like we're kind of coloring outside the lines, hard to feel our own boundaries. So this is a practice that enables, it provides a sense of containment. It's taking another moment here. And then we'll shift, we'll let this go. Okay. So I wish I had, 3 hours here with all of you to just go deeper into some of the details that informs all this. But I want to also have some dialogue. I realize we're close to time. So Barry, can I open it up with you? And
Yeah, sure.
What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, we can probably get to a couple of questions.
Great.
One here is, are there tools available to evaluate how trauma-informed a person is?
That's a great question. I want to answer that and then try to talk about the first question too. SAMHSA, S-A-M, you have to forgive me, I forget what the acronym stands for. SAMHSA has a chart that actually talks about different ways to assess whether a person or organization is trauma informed or trauma sensitive. It starts with trauma sensitive. What is it? Trauma. There's 4 stages. Apologies, I haven't seen it in a while. Trauma aware is the first stage, trauma sensitive, trauma informed, and then trauma focused. So those are 4 different stages, and they actually have bullet points for each. I have in my own training, you can, there's standards. The main standard that I hold for trauma sensitive is if you're trauma sensitive, you can do 4 things. You've realized it's 4 R's. You've realized how widespread trauma is. You can recognize trauma symptoms. You can respond effectively, and you can avoid re-traumatization. So realize, recognize trauma symptoms, respond effectively, and avoid re-traumatization. So there's no body necessarily centralized that's actually giving out certificates, but you can self-assess for yourself, like, how much work have I done here? Where do I need to focus in? And but the SAMHSA would also be a place to look. Barry, should we talk about the other? Do you want to do the written one? Or where do you want to go?
Yeah, 1 second. SAMHSA, by the way, is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, if you want to look for those resources.
Awesome.
I think in terms of the writing one, I think you've covered a lot of those. I think there's another question here that had a lot of votes that I think could be interesting.
Great.
So you gave a general definition of trauma, but there are specific traumas. And Hannah was wondering about, for example, trauma having to do with racism. Is there different applications depending on different types of traumas?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, for those of many of you be familiar with trauma, there are so many amazing researchers and different doorways into talking about trauma and the impact of trauma. We could have developmental trauma, something that's happening in youth. We could have complex trauma, talked about by Judith Herman and Bessel van der Kolk. Intergenerational trauma. We have systemic trauma that's connected to racial oppression or more generally being targeted by oppression. And that all of these different forms of trauma will relate back to that more general definition. And what I appreciate about the community that, I'm getting to connect with, we have these free monthly, we basically meet every month to talk about trauma sensitive mindfulness. There's so many people in the community who are actually focused on very specific elements of trauma and then coming up with certain modifications inside of that practice. So I'm at a very general level talking about nervous system dysregulation as it's impacted by trauma. And that could come from, again, racial oppression, developmental trauma. There's so many different ways in, and we're increasing our understanding over time. I want to give a quick shout out to Rhonda McGee, friend and colleague who wrote a book called The Inner Work of Racial Justice, which is talking a lot about trauma and racial oppression and how that's playing out inside of meditation practice and historically. So yes, and there are many powerful resources out there. Ruth King as well.
Well, we have just a little teensy bit of time left. I just wanted to share one story from Summer before we close. Summer is a psychology first aid counselor for disaster relief and COVID workers, doing that for the past year and a half, also handling young adult suicide attempts. She's recently been diagnosed with secondary PTSD. As an empath, she says, how can I, as a practitioner, separate others' suffering from my own?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Well, one, I'm sure you're not alone, and appreciate the vulnerability of sharing all that. Here's the one tip that I've learned. A woman named Babette Rothschild, who's a trauma specialist who wrote the book called The Body Remembers, says that for empaths, really for anyone working with trauma, there's something known as an empathy dial. And if you can learn to actually turn down the empathy dial, you're likely, you're someone at an 8 to a 10. Many of us will be sensitive. If there's a way to actually find grounded tools to help you turn down your empathy dial, that you may find that you will be just as effective at a 3 or a 4, and not be as porous to people that you're working with. So just a deep bow. I don't think you're alone there around the secondary trauma. And empathy dial would be a place to look, and experimenting yourself. That might be a place to check out.
David, this has been such a wonderful session, and I know that people are going to be coming back to this well for many years to access your work and the work of the colleagues and network that you are within. It's been a tremendous contribution to this field of mindfulness practice altogether. So I want to thank you for today. And everybody, if you want to find out more about David's work and training programs, his website is linked at the bottom of this session in Whova. So that's the end of our live program for today. But we do encourage you to watch the other on-demand sessions released today, and also to reach out to each other on the Whova app to start conversations and make connections. And please come back tomorrow for more on how mindfulness can help support your individual well-being. We have a full program tomorrow with 5 live sessions, including some of my favorite mindfulness teachers, Frank Ostaseski, Pat Rockman, and Lily Powell. Before you leave, also, if you wouldn't mind filling out a very short feedback form that you can find below this video in your Whova window, just click the rate session button. We hope to see you tomorrow and online in the app. And thanks again, David.
Thanks, Barry. It was an honor to be here. Thanks for holding this. Thanks for your work.
Oh, lovely. My pleasure. Be well.
Cheers.
Bye, all.
Bye, everyone.